Amy, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to have you on the show. I know how busy you are. And of all things, you've got your new book that's recently been released. There's so much going on. How are you? How are things? How's your week been?
Yeah, it's been an intense week. I'm not going to lie. You're right. Clinically, things are very busy at the moment, but I think you're well aware it's been World's Strongest Man this week. And we've got two athletes out there, Tom and Luke. And I'm not going to lie, I've been quite distracted this week. The results have been coming in. I'm in constant contact with Dan, their coach, and it's been exciting, and they've done a phenomenal job so far.
It's one of these events, and when I've had the guys on the show, or I keep in touch with Luke a lot more than I do with Tom, but it's really, we only get to see it at Christmas time. You know, it's one of these events. It's not live right now. We can't sort of set the clock. We can't watch them live and scream at the TV. It's an odd one, but I had both guys on the podcast last year, and I actually posted a little a wee sort of, as you do on Instagram, a wee thing of encouragement. But last year when they were on the show, they said, next year, please keep supporting us. We're going for number one, you know, and the two of them are sitting there and this, that, and the other. Yeah. And I've really enjoyed following them on Instagram and the journey that they've been on with collaborations, people they've met, the amount they eat, everything that they do is just such an enjoyable journey for us all to follow as fans of the two brothers. Now, to know that Tom's coming back as number two last year, going for number one, and Luke is going for number one as well. What a dynamic they've got together. But I'm very conscious in the stuff that I've read that you've done in the background with them, they are not just becoming stronger physically, but they're becoming a lot stronger mentally, where you step in. How have you enjoyed working with them? And I know you can't go too deep into what they've been doing, but just being around guys like that, top performers that are top of their game, they're renowned around the world, they're well-known athletes. What has it been like for you getting into their camp and sort of being around them?
Oh, it's been phenomenal. I've loved every minute of it. I mean, I've known Luke more so for a number of years, and we've been friends before this, where he supported me with the book that I've just written. He was the cover star of the book.
I was going to say, he got him. I didn't know if he knew he was going to be a cover model all those years ago.
Yeah, I know. He's got it on his wall now. He's very proud.
I bet he is.
So, he's also a chapter in the book in terms of his own journey to where he is today. Historically, he was part-time in the strongman world, but, this year he's absolutely full-time athlete, devoted to this entirely. And like you say, that's part of the journey that he's spoken about. But it's just been incredible. They are both phenomenal individuals and athletes. But there is an openness this year in terms of accessing anything really that's going to enhance their performance. And the team that they have around them is exceptional. You've got Dan, the coach, we've got a nutritionist, we've got Sinead, Cushy, Simon helping with all of their social media, their YouTube, and importantly, the Mulligan brothers as well, who I know you've spoken to in the past. And I think having the Mulligans around is so important to Tom and Luke. They're documenting this year, their journey. And you're right, I can't say too much about the work that we've been doing, but there will be a lot more about that in the Stoltman brothers documentary that the Mulligan brothers are delivering later on this year.
You see, when I speak to athletes at the moment and crowds are beginning to come back, I'm pretty sure there will be crowds around the lads as they compete at the strongman at the moment, but through events in the previous year through COVID, speaking to athletes, rugby players, Olympians, all these sorts of things, not having crowds there, they lose a lot of energy. They lose a lot of the, I wasn't going to say focus, but when there's a crowd there, you want to perform more, or there's more pressure on you. You see, when the Stoltmans and guys like that have the Mulligan brothers around, that surely enhances their training because they know that every single thing they do is on camera and it's been recorded. So not that they won't train hard when they're not being videoed or recorded, but what they're doing is going to go out to the world. That surely must enhance their training, knowing that the Mulligan brothers, Jordan and William and the team are there recording things. So they're thinking, I've got to do my best lift here. Which in turn will enhance their training. Maybe, do you think that's true, that a bit more, they'll get a bit more because they're actually creating an end product of their journey? Yeah. But it pushes them harder because they know that everything's been scrutinized.
Yeah. I mean, the Mulligan brothers have been quite public in talking about the Stoltmans wanting to leave a legacy.
Yeah.
And this documentary is all about recording that for them so that, they can document their journey. And I agree with you. Yes, I think it does push them on to really show what they're capable of doing. More than anything, though, I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Jordan or William yet. I've spoken to them a lot, but more than anything, I understand it's their energy and their attitude that they bring to the brothers and the documentary and the training, because the Mulligans are all about inspiring change. That's their motto, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And I think it's just something that they live and breathe. And when you're around that, I think it changes the energy for the Stoltman brothers as well, and that's incredibly helpful.
Because you've got to think that if you compare two athletes, one is in a garage on his own or a gym on his own, looking in the mirror, fighting himself and encouraging himself and inspiring himself, maybe with a coach there. If you've got a squad of inspiring people filming you, shouting at you, smacking you on the back, pushing you, watching you eat 25 eggs at breakfast, inspired by what you're doing, I think that route may just push you or give you the edge that you need to go and compete. There's something really truthful in that. And the Mulligan brothers, if there is two more inspiring guys out there that want to see people change and become better, they're the guys. Their content is incredible. Yeah,
there's so much excitement around them this year. There's a lot of people around them that want them to do really well.
Yeah.
And, they want to deliver for themselves, but for everyone else as well. I think they can pick up on that. It's just great. All of the variables have aligned this year. It's lovely to watch.
No, I'm going to say, but obviously Tom coming in second last year, he's coming back to try and get number one this year. But in any spectrum, when you've looked at athletes, how hard is that in a mindset to stay? Well, saying that, if you're second going for first, you've probably got that drive for a year. But getting that mindset to come back stronger, to think, that guy that came first is going to be there again. Where do athletes need to take themselves to go that one better, or to dominate and get that person that's in front of them out the way?
Yeah. So I can't say too much, but Tom is an interesting character because he talks openly about his autism.
Yeah, no, he spoke about it on the podcast and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So my role as a clinical psychologist is not just mental health, but I have further training in neuropsychology. So I work with individuals that are neurodiverse and present with very different cognitive profiles. So not just in terms of understanding the world, so visually, verbally, how they interpret information in front of them, but also emotionally, how they understand their thoughts differently. And so that will be different for every athlete, but it's been a very different process for Tom because of his autism. And, he's spoken openly in social media about his concrete thinking. So ultimately, if Tom wants to go for first, he'll go for first.
Good luck standing in his way.
Yeah, absolutely.
But see, if we look at athletes like Federer or Ronaldo or Messi or these sort of top performers that are at the top of their game for so long, what about that mindset and getting into their heads of staying at the top, being consistent for so many years and having their mind and body ready at the right time to always perform? That must be something that you've looked at, identified. That how do these athletes stay number one for so long?
Well, so my work is with a certain group of athletes. So I have to say that firstly. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm not a sports psychologist. So I work with athletes that might present with mental health difficulties, that might present with difficulties transitioning out of sport,
Okay.
Or might present with some internal conflicts when they're performing, and they want to work that through. But ultimately, what I see when you're talking about these athletes that year on, year out perform at the top of their game, I've started to observe a certain personality cluster within these athletes. And this is what the Skewed to the Right book is all about. You know, I've worked across different sports with different athletes, and there's a collection of personality traits which mean that these athletes are exceptional. But it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So I've noticed that we're looking at high values of obsessionality. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. High values of masochism, so pushing through the pain barrier. You know, you've played rugby before. We all know that if you experience pain whilst you're training, you have to push through it. You can't just give up at the first sight of pain.
Yep.
So it's about pushing through that pain barrier. You've also got to have high levels of aggression. You've got to want this. Otherwise, again, you just give up. And you've got to have high levels of focus. And there's this cluster of these kind of 4 traits. And I'm seeing that with all of these athletes that are exceptional, generally the ones that I come into contact with are skewed to the right. So they're higher than average on all of these traits. And I think if that is your personality type,
yeah.
I think it's inherently who you are. I think you don't know any different but to relate to your sport and life in this way. I think that's what keeps kind of getting you back every year.
Do you think that starts in childhood, sort of getting pushed to the right through parenting and environment? How early do you think it starts? Or do you think, or can it come at different stages where someone goes to school and they fall into the judo club and they realise, oh, I'm quite good at this, and then they just go down that rabbit hole?
Yeah. I mean, that's a big question. So you're talking to a psychodynamic psychotherapist. Yeah. So look, theoretically, I'm going to say, developmentally, absolutely, it's down to developmental experience. But of course, it is about initially cognitively being drawn to something and saying, oh, I like that. I quite like that. So I'm going to go try it. So you try it, but then it's rewarding. Okay. Yeah. And once it's rewarding, and, you know, I talk about neuropsychology in the book, we get that dopamine hit, and that's great. You know, it's pleasurable, it's satisfying. And then what happens is we now know from the neuropsychological research that then moves to an emotional circuit in the brain. So it's cognitively derived to an emotional circuit. And then we all start to feel good about it. So I'm sure you'll have experienced, well, I feel so much better after exercise. You know, you do your morning run, you do your spin, and you feel so much better. Okay. Yep. So then you're operating in that area. But then ultimately, it then moves to a motor circuit. So exercise becomes habitual or addictive. And that's where we find ourselves. So there's various different levels at play here in terms of where does this all start. So there's the neurological basis to all of this. There's the neurotransmitters bouncing around in the brain that's encouraging us to do this more. But there's also the psychological aspect of our development and our developmental stories. And Luke is a great example of that. His story is in the book. And it is no surprise with his developmental history that he became a strongman. When I interviewed him, the theme was all about adversity and the need to survive and to be strong. So this was even before, you know, his parents were on the scene. This was his grandparent, his
grandpa, Opa. And
Opa, exactly.
And that's kind of where I was sort of delving into there, that how it can come through the generations, that Luke can feel that hurt that his granddad went through, and adversity and everything, and that's instilled in him.
Yeah.
To never stop. to keep pushing, to keep going. When it gets hard, he's almost good. Like, keep going. How hard is this going to be? And then is there a point when, or is it for the Joe public that looks in to an athlete's career that can say they're obsessed with that? So it's a wee bit much. They're obsessed when actually the athlete's thinking, no, I'm addicted.
Yes.
The obsession to being addicted, and an athlete being addicted in their core sport or their journey, or I'm addicted to do whatever it takes to win gold.
Yeah.
That must be a hard place to get to get all the distractions out the way.
Yeah, hugely. And I think it was a point in the interview when I interviewed Luke that I did keep on pushing him, to be honest. And I said, so are you obsessed? And he was like, yeah, F it, I'm obsessed. I'll say it. And there's this part of him that almost didn't want to acknowledge it back then, because what does that mean if we're obsessed? Do
I have a problem? Is there something wrong with me? Yeah, no, in their own heads, are they going down that route of, well, I'm obsessed with it? Should I be? Is it okay? What will other people think of me?
Yeah. And with obsession, there then comes all of these negative terms of, well, you're just selfish. If you're obsessed, then you're selfish. And what about your partner? What about your family? Are you thinking of anyone else but yourself? And then is that okay? And you can just get down a bit of a rabbit hole with it, really.
Yeah. You mentioned sort of clusters and things like that, and the bell curve. I know that's something that you look at, you talk about, and if I butcher this explanation of the bell curve, tell me, jump in and you take the lead. But as a general population, we kind of we're clustered in the middle, and skewed to the right is maybe high performers, people that have moved away from the sort of common man and woman that are now in a sort of exceptional area of their chosen field.
Absolutely.
Now, something I read on, maybe it was one of your Instagram posts or something, but it was about weight cutting. And it was about where you've got to go in that world that, say, boxers, UFC, even what Tom and Luke have to eat to put on so much weight to be able to lift such heavy things, that the average man and woman, that would be looked at as they've got an eating disorder.
Yeah.
But when they push themselves to become elite in their field, it's normal and it's accepted. Now, don't laugh at this. I recently took on the carnivore challenge, if you're familiar with what that is.
I'm not. You'll have to explain it to me. You're talking to a vegetarian. So.
Oh, no. Okay. Well, what it is, we're polar opposites. But what I'd say is the carnivore diet is a full meat diet. It's all meat. You're allowed eggs, water, and black coffee.
Wow.
Okay. So I'm now off it, and I got off it pretty quick because it didn't do, or it wasn't enjoyable. It made me, the fatigue was horrific. And I've got 3 young children, a business to run. I'm fit and active. And I was doing this to challenge myself. I've got a couple of niggling injuries myself. I'm not probably running as far or doing the things I would usually do. So I thought, what else can I do? And at the same time, Abby, my wife, she went vegan.
Oh, okay? Wow.
So in the house, we had a carnivore and a vegan, 3 babies, 3 kids. And it's just been a lot of fun. But to the point where I went so extreme on it and lasted, I think, 8 days. I've now started this is really current. I've now started bringing in broccoli, and I've actually fallen into sort of a keto diet of more broccoli, greens, strawberries, berries, dark chocolate, a little bit more coffee, with some milk, which is actually what a treat. But for weight cutting in a boxer's world or fighter's world or something, the extremes they have to go to, and they can't quit. They can't change the plan because they've got to make that weight. What does that do to an athlete to put such strain on their body, to put such strain on their mind that they cannot waver? Because if they don't hit that weight on that specific date, or Tom and Luke are not heavy enough, they're not as heavy as the next guy to lift that weight, that must mentally be draining. It must mentally be extremely tough to do that weight side of thing that you've got to adapt your body.
Yeah. It's phenomenal pressure. I mean, my background was in rowing.
Yeah.
And I was invited to be a lightweight rower. And this is when I first noticed it, to be fair. I mean, before that, I was a swimmer, but I then went on to rowing. So I was aware of sporting culture. But being around the lightweight rower population. I mean, it was in the context of studying my first degree in psychology at the time. And I just thought, this isn't right. You know, this is nuts, really. What's going on here? So you've said it correctly. The behaviors around me, if I was in an average, typical population, those individuals would go to their GP and they would be diagnosed with an eating disorder. Wow. But because these individuals were in a boat and they were competing and they had a goal weight to reach and they had to weigh in at that weight, these practices were just kind of accepted or ignored. And in the book, I speak to ex-GB lightweight rower. And in terms of physically and mentally what it does to you, he went much further than me. You know, I stopped, I think my appendix went, and then I went, no, enough. So, you know, I said enough, but he went much further than me. And he talks about how mentally he just reframed it. He reframed this behavior, not as something atypical, but just as something functional. So even when I was interviewing him, there wasn't really a sense of being comfortable in naming it as bulimia. Instead, it was named as functional vomiting. That's what I was doing. Wow. It was functional vomiting to get the job done. And is it bulimia if once I leave the sport, I'm no longer doing it? But ultimately, I mean, this athlete got to the place where his kidneys were shutting down. He was injured. He got glandular fever. You know, physically, your body shuts down, but also cognitively, we can't ignore that. You know, if you're not nourishing your body, not only can you not physically deliver, but mentally and cognitively, you can't deliver either because you're starving your body ultimately.
I can. Testament to that is I was calling it brain fog, that not eating the greens, not getting nutrients, fruit, energy into me. And I've still not had carbs. I'm going to stick to the month with no carbs because I'm getting carbs from other areas. And I mean, what I've done is I've researched nutrition more than I've ever done in my entire life. Okay. And as a dad and as a regular guy, I'm so pleased that I took on that challenge. And in my head, it's a failure. I didn't make 30 days that I put on Instagram and made myself accountable. I'm going to do this. But I thought I'm going to hurt myself here if I don't change. And I tried to keep training as much as I would and could with slight injuries and doing what I could. But I had to quickly adapt and change to try and get my body back to where it operates the best, because I can't afford to be a bit foggy and hazy. I'd come home from work and climbing a set of stairs, the energy in my leg, the tiredness in my legs would be painful. I'd have to stop at the top of the stairs, and then the mood swings would kick in. Yeah. So an athlete, and this is just a small experiment or challenge that I did, but athletes going through maybe a 10-year career of ups and downs and changes and diets. You're too heavy. You need to cut a bit. You're in the fat club. Whoa! What strain on your mindset. Yeah. Almost not knowing if you're coming or going.
Yeah. And it, like you say, I mean, it's the long-term implications of that on your psychological functioning afterwards. You know, it's not just something you can switch off. It becomes a part of who you are, what you're monitoring, your appraisal of yourself, how you relate to your body as well. Did you watch the documentary on Freddie Flintoff and his eating disorder? I did, yeah.
That's really interesting that what he went through at cricket at the highest level, the most famous cricketer in the world, you could say, to this day, he still has the same issues because he doesn't like the way he looks.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. Eating disorders are one of the most entrenched mental illnesses in terms of trying to change your mentality. It's tough, you know, it's how you relate to your body, yourself, your image, your identity. It's a long journey afterwards. And I think we have to take responsibility for what we're expecting from our athletes as well. I mean, in the chapter with the jockey, Mark Enright, I can't remember the stats now, don't quote me directly, but, you know, physiologically, we are getting heavier and taller. That's fact. But these weight ranges that our athletes are having to adhere to are not responding to that in the same way. So these historical weights that have been set are not moving with the trend for us getting heavier and taller. So actually it's getting harder and harder to meet these weight limits that are set. And we need to think about that and make some responsible changes. I think horse racing has. I think they've changed it by a small percentage, but it's still not in line with how much we are getting heavier. And we need to think responsibly about what sort of people we're churning out after these people are no longer athletes.
Yeah, and it's the aftercare, isn't it? When they're no longer athletes, it's thanks very much. You got paid, you got looked after, you know, now off you go into the big bad world and fend for yourself. Yeah. That's a scary time, especially if you're a top performer. Often there's a commentary role, or you'll kind of still stay in the bubble of that sport.
Yeah.
But it's when you're maybe a mediocre team player, you're a fully fledged professional, but you're maybe not a starter, you're maybe not a household name, and your contract gets cut, or the new contract's for a lot less money, and you've got to move your whole family to another country. That can be a very scary and daunting time. And I've been around a bit of it with rugby players here in Edinburgh. I've seen it. I've seen players come in and speak to me about potential 9-to-5 work opportunities after playing rugby, and that's a huge adjustment.
It's frightening, isn't it? I mean, there's practical considerations, isn't there, where, like you say, some of our athletes are fortunate enough to have the insurance packages around them within certain clubs, and so they have access to the best doctors, the best physios, this infrastructure around them. But like you say, as soon as it's over, it's over. And then, you know, suddenly you have to register with a GP. You know, you've never been registered with a GP, and how on earth do you access these people to help you? Because, you know, we've never had to do that before. So there's almost this steep learning curve first before you can even access these people and who you need to see, let alone the financial cost implications of that as well. And the journey itself after you've left sport is huge.
Yeah, there's a void. There's a massive void there. Do you find that people come to you because for too long they've said, I'm fine? You know, after they leave sport, and how you doing? How's the new job going? Oh, I'm fine. It's great. Loving it. But then maybe there's a breaking point. Do you get a lot of people sort of I don't want to say diagnosing, self-referring to you, or maybe old teammates? Or how do people usually find their way to you to say, I'm in a bad place. This isn't working what I'm doing. Can we talk about it?
Yeah. Often referrals are through sports doctors attached to clubs. Okay. But it is largely word of mouth as well, like you say, in self-referral. And yes, if somebody contacts me, it's because they're struggling. And there's this moment, a really challenging moment where, you know, I'm sure we've all been there. What I've been doing is no longer working for me. And that's the point when they pick up the phone, really, or they contact me.
Yeah. And then with you, sort of on the clinical side, a lot of teams will have a sports psychologist in their team. Mm-hmm. But then would someone be referred to you because it's maybe beyond what the sports psychologist can deal with, if it's into sort of maybe serious depression or anxiety and those sorts of worlds?
Yeah. So in terms of the difference between what I do and what a sports psychologist does, generally speaking, because we're all trained slightly differently, but generally speaking, I always say that a sports psychologist will get involved to enhance performance as long as there is a solid psychological base there already. So you're pretty stable. You're in an okay spot. You might have a bit of performance anxiety, but really you want to just enhance your performance. You want to look at setting goals, looking at your motivation, and getting to the top of your game. I kind of get involved when either the sports doctor or the sports psychologist will triage that individual, and there's this awareness that actually that stable base isn't very stable anymore. There's something else going on. Now, whether that's depression, anxiety, grief, loss, our athletes are not immune to all of these mental health difficulties that everybody can be exposed to. And so if any of those present, then that's when I would get involved.
How is your relationship with coaches? Because coaches always want their best player. You're smiling. I can imagine it's something that, I mean, even when I played rugby years ago now, there maybe was a little bit of this around, but psychology in sport is a lot more prevalent now. It's very much talked about, and as we are here to talk about it, people will listen because it's of interest. But years ago, like concussion, it wouldn't be considered. I got a bang on the head, get back on the pitch. I'm not feeling right today, coach. Get on the pitch, get on with it. Whereas today, someone could be referred to you. Our coach is usually a bit like, hey, I need my player. I need my best player back on. He's the goal kicker. She's my right wing. I need her on the park. Is there ever any sort of disagreements with coaches or fundamental sort of they don't get on with you or don't want their players to go and see you?
Yeah. At times. Look, every coach is different. Yeah. And there are some phenomenal coaches out there that basically just say, look, I just want the player to be healthy, happy, right. And if that means that sport isn't for them anymore, then that's what we're dealing with. I want to deliver good people, not just good players. But then you're right, there are other coaches that, of course, understandably, it's their job. They have an agenda. They have an agenda to get their best players on that pitch and to perform and to win. Mm-hmm. So there is a tension. Now, I can sometimes be the coach's best friend, because if we do look at these mental health issues and actually it means that the individual wants to return to sport and their performance is enhanced, then, the coach is really happy. But sometimes if an athlete comes in, ethically, my responsibility is to support that individual back to a position of health and where they are okay. And ultimately, my agenda is not whether they win on the pitch. My agenda is that they're healthy. And if that means that enhances their performance, then that's great. But if it means that actually in order for them to be healthy and in a state of good well-being and they need to step away from the sport, then that's what I need to support them to do and help them do that.
One thing that isn't talked about that often in sports and in teams, but I suppose any kind of athlete usually has a coach, is the stress and the impact on coaches themselves. Because the players or the team have to turn up at this time, they do their training and they go home and they get the coffees or this, that and the other. The coach, and I've got many friends that have gone from playing into coaching, and it is a real sort of, sometimes a real shock that, oh my, the team are away, but I've got another 5 hours planning, structures, speak to that player, team meeting, speak to that player, review that game. The stress that coaches go through, is that talked about a great deal? Is that something that you deal with coaches in that regard, that we always think about and worry about the players, but the stresses on coaches is huge?
Yeah, it is. It's a huge responsibility, and often with competing agendas and pressures. I don't have much experience of it, typically because in terms of you're saying, how do people relate to me? I often sit outside of these clubs, and for good reason, because there is often a fear that if I'm inside the club, am I just part of that agenda to get them back on the field? So I'm kind of quite separate from that. So I can't comment too much on the coaches, I'm afraid.
Okay. An area that I scribbled down here, and it was one of your posts on Instagram, relating to the book, and I suppose rugby, contact sport, or even strongman, the relationship between pain and self-harm. Mm-hmm. That it's been discussed that some athletes they maybe don't talk about it openly or ever say it, but their endorphins get going when they are in pain, or they can take their body to a threshold of excruciating pain that ends up with an incredible result.
Yeah.
How does that manifest in a brain that somebody can get their like lifting one of these Atlas stones that Tom throws around, and what these guys do, the pain in his forearms and his body, but he thrives on it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that's him. That's him, the gladiator in the arena. This is where he operates
Mm-hmm.
at that pain threshold. How did they get their mindset to take them where they know they're going to be hurt?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a gradual process throughout developmental experience. You know, like you say, you expose yourself to the pain, you get the feedback within the neurotransmitters within the body. And the more that you are exposed to those neurotransmitters, the more of that neurotransmitter you need to feel the same level of intensity. Mm-hmm. So again, you know, you spoke about Flintoff earlier. I mean, he's also known for being incredibly risky and putting himself in these situations that a lot of us just wouldn't do. And he needs to go right to the edge before he kind of feels something, or that's my perception of it when I've watched it. But I mean, in terms of self-harm, the skew to the right phenomena is that I argue that if you are skewed to the right and you have a higher level of masochism, you fall within an above average range. But there is a risk of being in this above average range where you push yourself and you can tolerate these higher levels of pain, but then you're on a knife's edge in terms of falling over into the next range, which is the extremely high range, so the tail end of the bell curve. And that's when we get our mental health difficulties presenting, because you've tipped over into something quite risky, where ultimately, like you're saying, you have to experience such levels of pain before you can receive that feedback. But also psychologically, masochism as well is about an expression of aggression towards the self, though. So potentially people use their sport to express aggression in a socially acceptable way. You know, rugby players on the field, you know, you can express some aggression. It's acceptable. No one's told off. And it allows you to discharge something. Mm-hmm. Some people do that outwardly. Some people do it inwardly. And self-harm can be seen as an expression of aggression for people that might struggle to outwardly express it. So there's not only the kind of neurological basis of this or the neurotransmitter basis, but also the psychological basis as to why people might tip over into that area.
I found it very interesting reading about your interactions with Nigel Owens, the referee, and we're talking about pain and physical sport, but the mental side of things that he's had to overcome with his sexuality and how extreme he thought with bulimia and everything else that was going on in his world. It's incredible that we talk about sport and we look at strongmen and we look at rugby players and all these sorts of things, but Nigel isn't that. He is not an aggressive man. He is not in that world. He's in the rugby world. It can be a very masculine world where he is. But you've had interviews with him, and even you put a post out today that his mindset and his mentality was so skewed that he didn't know what was right. Is that right, the way you describe it? He didn't know what was right, what was wrong, how to talk to people. What's been your experience there when it's not necessarily an athlete or somebody that is performing physically?
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's a phenomenal referee. I mean, he's retired now, hasn't he?
Unfortunately, the way he reffed games and opened games up and spoke to the players internationally, he was the best. He always will be.
Yeah, great sense of humor as well. So in terms of personality structure, I'll try not to go too far down the rabbit hole with this, but you know, in psychoanalysis, Freud talks about the id, so these internal instincts that we all have, the drives that we have. So food, sex, pleasure. And then we have a superego, which is our internal referee. So it's quite a nice exploration with Nigel's story. We all have an internal referee or social monitor that tells us what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And that's shaped and formed developmentally over the years from our parenting, religion as well, because Nigel, I think, had a background with, I can't remember now. I think he had a background with religion as well, where there was this sense of what was right and what was wrong. And those things are internalized. And then what forms out of that is our ego. That's who we are. But Nigel had an instinct, a sexual instinct, where he was attracted to men. But his superego, his internal referee, because of his developmental background in rural Wales, was telling him that he'd never been exposed to this and this wasn't acceptable. And I think, over the years, there was this sense of him just wanting to get rid of that. And that's what today's post is about. And that's when we start to see symbolism in mental health symptoms that, like you say, it was an absolute extreme example of this. And that's what Skewed to the Right is about. That we're talking about extremes here, and if people aren't in that extreme area, then they wouldn't come and see me. They'd be happily getting on with their lives. So he got to an extreme place where, it was chemical castration, bulimia, washing himself for long periods of time, and eventually a couple of suicide attempts that he's spoken openly about, but all around this theme of just wanting to get rid of something because you can't accept it. It's a phenomenal story. And I think, again, it suggests that you don't just have to be a player in sport. Yeah. This can affect all of us. And I think we're drawn to certain things that allow us to relate to our environment in a certain way. So sports people are drawn to sport for a reason. For Nigel, I think he was drawn to refereeing because he constantly had this internal battle with his own internal referee telling him what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. That was just entirely familiar to him as a process.
With someone like Nigel, when he told his story, it obviously is, it's newsworthy that a well-known man has come out and being so open about this. Do you think that makes it even harder being in the public eye to come out and talk like this? And I ask that because someone that isn't famous or isn't on the TV every Saturday reffing games and people don't know you, is it easier for someone to sort of tell their story just to their friends and in their local community that won't go too far? It won't be in the press. It won't go further. How different is that for sort of well-known faces to tell their story and go completely public to the everyday man and woman to just tell their best friend, and even that will help them?
Yeah, incredibly difficult. I often have discussions with sports people and on what they will release and what they feel comfortable about. And there should always be boundaries around that. Just because these individuals are in the limelight doesn't mean that everything it should be out there for public consumption. It's so much more challenging. And, with social media platforms nowadays, in some ways, they're an incredible asset that we have now for people to have platforms and to make change in a positive direction. But also, I think when people realize that people are big names, they have a big platform, it can draw certain personalities to express certain things that they might not otherwise be able to express or have the same size plus to express. And it can get very challenging, really difficult.
And everything we've discussed is explored in the book, Skewed to the Right. What was that journey like to get the book to publication? Was a book something you always wanted to create, or did it sort of, you didn't see it coming and an opportunity arose? How did it come to be?
Yeah. No, I never really planned it, to be fair. It was quite an organic thing, but I like that about life. I like how it kind of falls out really in this way. And so my sporting journey, about 20 years ago, I was rowing. Then I kind of did my psychological training, and I then went back to university and said, look, I've done my training now. So if you've got any athletes with mental health difficulties, just let me know. And then they were like, well, yeah, this couldn't have come at a better time. You know, we've got people with eating disorders, we've got self-harming, we need someone to help with this. And then it just snowballed from there, really. And now I'm working with a lot of different people across different sports. But throughout this journey, I also did my own psychodynamic psychotherapy as part of the training. So I was on the couch for about 6 years, and that was a long process. But as part of that journey, I realized that I wanted to start to explore this in more detail, look at sport, look at the personalities that I was working with. And the book took about 5 years to write. So wow. I, as part of my journey, I realized that, you know, I needed a day a week to do something different, to be creative and to have that space. And then I'll work for 4 intense clinical days, and I'll do a day a week writing. And it's been a really cathartic process for me as well. And it's lovely to have it out there. It's been a journey, but we've got there eventually.
And that's quite interesting to me, because I've spoken to, as I say, lots of athletes and coaches and things like that. And I spoke to a high performance manager, Laura Penhall, who's looked after Mark Beaumont going around the world and all sorts of challenges. And I asked her job is to look after the athlete on these challenges and world record attempts. I said, how are you? How is she during it? She's like, Nashy, I'd forget to wash, I would forget to eat, and she'd get to the end of a challenge and she'd be absolutely shattered. Can I ask you, what's it like in your profession? You do weekly, daily speak to people, and they give you their problems. They give you all these. Are you able to detach yourself from work, or is that something that profession it's going to be with you forever, and it can be challenging yourself personally?
Yeah, it is challenging, but and I think yes, you do have to detach, but personally, my position as well is that if I wasn't attached to my patients and I didn't care about them, I don't think I should be doing my job. So as much as, yes, you know, we can all sit here and say you should detach and you should just switch it off. I don't think that's ever possible. You know, at times people do pop into your mind, and you care about who you work with and you want the best for them. I think I'm a big fan of boundaries, and everyone that knows me will say that. You know, I really try and say, right, these are my working hours. And if I'm not working, then I need to invest in other areas of my life, my people around me, my partner, my family, my friends. That's really important. And, you know, I talk to athletes all the time about this. You know, I talk to them about the tower versus the pyramid. It can't all be in one area of your life, because if it is, it's going to fall over. We need a pyramid. We need relationships, we need hobbies, we need work. And so, you know, I talk about that a lot to people, and it would be wrong if I wasn't following that myself. So, you know, I'm a big advocate of the pyramid model and having other things outside of work. And that's really helpful. And, you know, I need to be in the best place I can be. Otherwise, I'm going to be no good to anyone.
Yep, no, I get that. That's a good analogy, the pyramid model. That makes a lot of sense. But you've committed your professional life to helping people. So, you know, thank you for doing that. You're helping a lot of people, and you're telling their stories, and that will help other people in turn. So, yeah, fantastic. Where can people get the book? Where can people connect with you, Amy?
Yeah, so the book's available on Amazon, WH Smith, Waterstones. I think people still shop in those places as well. It's available directly from the publisher at Firing the Mind. And then I'm on LinkedIn at Dr. Amy Izycky, and you've mentioned Instagram kindly a number of times at Amy Izycky, if you can spell my surname.
Perfect. Just give us a spell. Izycky.
Yeah, that's correct.
Amy Izycky. So, Amy, thank you very much for joining me. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks so much. It's been good to talk.
Fire! Go!